The moment Shedeur Sanders started getting real QB1 attention, everything changed. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about development anymore. It turned into debate, backlash, and straight-up criticism. And what's crazy is, a lot of that noise didn't come from fans, it came from the media. Because the second the Browns' front office showed signs of believing in Shedeur, certain voices started pushing back hard. Why? That's the question nobody's answering directly. On the surface, it sounds like normal analysis, concerns about turnovers, decision-making, consistency. But when you look closer, something feels off. The same people who were using inside sources and throwing subtle shots before are now changing their tone completely. So what really happened behind the scenes? Because this isn't just about a quarterback anymore. This is about narratives, pressure, and a situation that's starting to expose a lot more than just Shedeur Sanders. And what happened next might tell you exactly why this story is blowing up right now. It all started with one simple question, but the answer changed everything. During a discussion on a Cleveland sports show, G. Bush put a well-known sports writer on the spot. No build-up, no soft setup, just a direct question. What does Shedeur Sanders actually need to prove this season to stop the Browns from drafting another quarterback? Simple, right? But this is where things got interesting. Because for months, there had been a certain narrative floating around. Concerns about Shedeur weren't just about his play, they included whispers about people inside the building, questions about his leadership, even criticism of the attention he brings. It wasn't always clear where those takes were coming from, but they were out there. And then suddenly, when asked directly, all of that disappeared. Instead of repeating those same talking points, the answer shifted completely. Now it was about basic quarterback fundamentals. Don't throw interceptions on early downs. Don't take sacks in critical situations. Show command of the offense. Help the team function at a higher level. In other words, the exact same expectations every quarterback in the league is judged by. Nothing extreme, nothing unusual, nothing that justified the earlier noise. And that's what caught people's attention. Because if those are the real standards, then why wasn't that the message from the beginning? Why were there hints of behind-the-scenes issues before, but now it's just football? That moment didn't just answer a question, it exposed a shift. A shift in tone, a shift in narrative, and possibly a shift in how this whole situation is being handled publicly. Fans picked up on it immediately. Because when someone goes from indirect criticism to straightforward analysis overnight, it raises questions. It makes people wonder what changed and why. Was it pressure? Was it being called out publicly? Or was it simply that when asked directly, with no room to hide, the only honest answer left was the obvious one? And here, where it gets even more interesting. Because this wasn't just about one analyst or one moment. It opened the door to a much bigger conversation about how Shedeur Sanders has been covered from the start, and whether the criticism has always been as fair as it seemed. And once you start looking at it from that angle, things begin to look very different. And this is where people really started paying attention, because it wasn't just what was said, it was what stopped being said. For weeks, even months, there had been a certain tone around Shedeur Sanders. Not always direct, not always loud, but definitely there. Subtle comments about what was happening inside the building. Questions about leadership. Doubts that didn't always come from game film, but from things fans couldn't verify. It created a cloud. Not strong enough to fully discredit him, but enough to make people hesitate. And then suddenly, that cloud vanished. The moment the question became direct and unavoidable, the conversation shifted to pure football. No more mentions of unnamed sources. No more hints about off-field concerns. Just performance. Can he run the offense? Can he avoid costly mistakes? Can he put the team in position to win? That's it. Which, if we're being honest, is exactly how quarterbacks should be evaluated in the first place. So naturally, fans started asking questions. Because if those were always the real standards, why introduce anything else before? Why bring up outside narratives, only to drop them the moment you're asked to explain your position clearly? Some believe, and this is where things get interesting, that the earlier criticism may have leaned too heavily on speculation. That instead of sticking strictly to what shows up on film, the conversation drifted into areas that are harder to prove and easier to misinterpret. Now, to be fair, not everything said was necessarily wrong. In the NFL, teams talk, information circulates, opinions form behind closed doors. That's part of the game. But the issue isn't whether conversations happen. It's how they're presented. Because when speculation gets mixed in with analysis, it can shape perception in a powerful way, especially for a young quarterback trying to establish himself. And that's exactly what makes this shift so important. Because once the focus returns to football, to actual performance, the conversation becomes clearer, more grounded, more fair. But it also raises another question. If the narrative has already influenced how people view Shedeur, how much of that perception is still lingering? Because first impressions stick. And even when the story changes, the impact of what was said before doesn't just disappear. So now, Shedeur isn't just stepping into a quarterback role. He's stepping into a situation where he has to prove more than just his ability on the field. He has to prove that the noise around him was never the full story. And that's where things take another turn. Because once you start comparing how he's being judged to how other quarterbacks are treated, the conversation gets even more complicated. And this is where the conversation really starts to heat up, because once you look beyond the surface, a bigger question starts to form. Is Shedeur Sanders being judged differently? Now every quarterback gets criticized, that's part of the position. Mistakes get magnified, decisions get questioned, and performance is constantly under the spotlight. That's normal. But what fans started noticing is how those standards seem to shift depending on who the quarterback is. Take turnovers, for example. We've seen top quarterbacks throw interceptions in big moments. We've seen them hold onto the ball too long, take sacks, make risky plays, and still get the benefit of the doubt. Analysts call it aggressive playmaking or trying to extend the play. But when it comes to Shedeur, those same situations get framed differently. Suddenly, it's about poor decision-making, lack of awareness, questions about whether he can handle the pressure. And that contrast hasn't gone unnoticed. Some fans believe, and this is where speculation comes in, that Shedeur entered the league with a different kind of spotlight. He's not just a quarterback, he's a name, a personality, a player who's been talked about long before he ever took an NFL snap. And with that comes stronger opinions, both positive and negative. There's also the style factor. Shedeur plays with confidence. He carries himself a certain way. And while that confidence is praised in some players, it can be interpreted differently in others. That alone can shape how people react to his performance, even when the results are similar. Now, to be clear, none of this means criticism isn't valid. Every quarterback has areas to improve. Shedeur is no different. Decision-making, timing, pocket awareness, those are real parts of the game that matter. But the debate isn't about whether he should be criticized. It's about whether he's being criticized the same way as everyone else. Because consistency matters. If the standard is performance, then it should apply equally across the board. Good plays should be recognized, mistakes should be addressed, and the evaluation should stay grounded in what actually happens on the field. But when perception starts to shift based on narrative, That's when things get complicated. And that's exactly where Shedeur finds himself right now. Because he's not just trying to prove he can play at this level. He's trying to prove that the way he's being judged is fair in the first place. And that adds a whole new layer of pressure. Because now, every throw, every decision, every game isn't just about performance. It's about changing how people see him. And that's not easy. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, there's only one thing that can truly silence all of this noise. And it's not opinions. It's not narratives. It's not debates. It's results. And that's where the real test begins. At the end of the day, when you strip away all the noise, all the debates, and all the narratives, the expectations for Shedeur Sanders are actually very clear. And the interesting part is they're not unrealistic. They're not even unique. They're the same things every quarterback in the league is expected to show, especially one stepping into a bigger role. It starts with decision-making. Limiting turnovers, especially in crucial situations, is non-negotiable. Coaches can live with aggressive throws, but they can't live with careless ones that cost games. Then there's pocket awareness, understanding when to extend a play and when to let it go. Holding on to the ball too long can kill drives just as quickly as a bad interception. These are the details that separate potential from production. But it doesn't stop there. Command of the offense might be the biggest factor. Can he step into the huddle and take control? Can he read defenses quickly, adjust at the line, and keep the offense moving without hesitation? Because in the NFL, it's not just about talent, it's about control. The best quarterbacks don't just play the game, they manage it. And that's what people want to see from Shedeur. Not perfection, but progression. Not highlight plays, but consistency. And then there's something that often gets overlooked, how the team performs around him. Because whether it's fair or not, quarterbacks are always tied to results. If the offense looks organized, if drives are sustained, if the team starts winning more games, that credit goes to the quarterback. But if things fall apart, the blame usually follows the same path. That's just how the position works. And in Shedeur's case, that connection becomes even stronger because of everything surrounding him. So when people ask what he needs to prove, the answer isn't complicated. He needs to show he can lead a functional offense. He needs to show that the game isn't moving too fast for him. And most importantly, he needs to show that he can turn potential into actual results on the field. Because once that happens, a lot of the outside noise starts to fade on its own. But until then, every game, every drive, every decision becomes part of the evaluation. And that's exactly why what happens next is going to matter more than anything that's been said so far. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. This isn't just about Shedeur Sanders. Because no quarterback, no matter how talented, succeeds alone. And when you look at the Browns' situation, it becomes clear that a lot of what happens this season won't just depend on Shedeur's performance. It will depend on everything around him. Last season exposed some real issues. The offense wasn't consistent. The protection broke down at key moments. Play calling didn't always put players in the best position to succeed. And overall, there were too many situations where the team just didn't execute the way it needed to. That's not something one player fixes overnight. So while Shedeur will be under the spotlight, the bigger question is whether the team has actually improved around him. Because if the offensive line struggles again, if receivers aren't creating separation, if the system doesn't flow the way it should, then it won't matter how much potential he has. The results won't match. And that's where things can get tricky. Because quarterbacks are always judged by outcomes, not context. If the offense stalls, people don't always look at protection or root concepts. They look at the quarterback. If drives end early, if points aren't being scored, the pressure shifts directly onto him, regardless of what's happening behind the scenes. And that's the challenge Shedeur is walking into. He's not just stepping into a role. He's stepping into expectations tied to an entire unit that still has things to prove. Now, to be fair, there are signs that the Browns are trying to address those issues. There's been movement around the roster. There's been a focus on improving key areas. But until it shows up on the field, it's all just potential. And potential doesn't win games. Execution does. That's why this situation is bigger than just one player. Because if the offense takes a step forward, Shedeur will get the credit. But if it doesn't, he'll carry the weight of it, whether it's fully on him or not. And that's what makes this season so important. Because this isn't just about proving he belongs. It's about proving that the environment around him is finally good enough to let him succeed. And if that part doesn't come together, then the conversation around Shedeur Sanders won't get quieter. It'll get even louder. But while all the attention is on Shedeur Sanders and the offense, there's another piece of this puzzle that completely changes the situation, and that's Myles Garrett. Because what he represents goes far beyond just defense. Having a player like Garrett on your team doesn't just help you win games, it changes the entire structure of how your team competes. He's the kind of player offenses have to account for on every single snap. He creates pressure, forces mistakes, and keeps games within reach even when the offense isn't fully clicking. And for a young quarterback stepping into a major role, that kind of support is invaluable. It takes pressure off. Because when your defense can hold opponents, create turnovers, and give you extra possessions, you don't have to play perfect football to stay competitive. You don't have to force risky throws or try to carry the entire game on your shoulders. You can develop naturally, make smarter decisions, and grow into the role instead of being thrown into chaos. That's what makes Garrett's presence so important to this entire situation. And it's also why the idea of moving on from him, something that's been talked about in certain circles, doesn't really make sense when you look at it from a football perspective. Because no head coach, especially one trying to establish himself, willingly gives up his best player. Coaches don't think in terms of long-term rebuilds the way fans or analysts sometimes do. They think about winning now. They think about putting the best possible team on the field every Sunday. And removing a game-changing defensive player goes directly against that mindset. It doesn't help your quarterback. It doesn't help your team. And it definitely doesn't help your chances of winning. In fact, it does the opposite. Because without a player like Garrett, everything becomes harder. The defense takes a step back. The margin for error shrinks. And suddenly, more pressure shifts onto the offense and ultimately onto Shedeur. And that's not the position you want to put a young quarterback in. So when you look at the bigger picture, Garrett isn't just a star player, he's a stabilizer. He's the reason this team can stay competitive while the offense figures itself out. He's the reason the Browns don't have to rush everything or force situations that aren't ready yet. And that matters more than people realize. Because if the goal is to give Shedeur Sanders the best possible chance to succeed, then keeping everything around him stable, especially on the defensive side, becomes just as important as anything happening on offense. And that's what makes this situation so interesting. Because while everyone is debating the quarterback, the real foundation of this team might already be set. And if that foundation holds, then what happens next could change everything. And this is where everything comes together. Because no matter what's been said, no matter what's been debated, no matter how many opinions are out there, this upcoming season is going to expose the truth. Not just about Shedeur Sanders, but about everyone. Because once the games start, there's nowhere to hide. No more speculation. No more sources say. No more shifting narratives. It all comes down to performance. For Shedeur, this is the moment where everything gets tested. Can he handle the speed of the game? Can he stay composed under pressure? Can he lead an offense that actually produces when it matters? Those are the questions people have been asking, and now they're finally going to get real answers. But it doesn't stop with him. This season will also reveal whether the criticism was ever truly justified, or if it was built more on perception than reality. Because if he goes out there and performs, if he shows command, limits mistakes, and moves the offense effectively, then a lot of those earlier doubts start to fall apart. The narrative shifts, the conversation changes, and suddenly the same voices that questioned him will have to adjust again. But if he struggles, if the offense looks disorganized, if mistakes pile up, if results don't follow, then the criticism gets louder. And that's the reality of the situation. Because in the NFL, everything is earned in real time. There's also pressure on the organization. Because this isn't just about evaluating a quarterback, it's about proving that the decisions they've made are working. The roster moves, the coaching changes, the direction of the team, all of it gets tested at the same time. If things click, it validates everything. If they don't, it raises even bigger questions. And that's what makes this season so important. Because it's not just another year. It's a turning point. A moment where potential either becomes reality or gets exposed for what it really is. And the craziest part, it's all about to play out in real time for everyone to see. And when you step back and look at everything, it's clear this was never just about opinions or debates. It was always about timing. Because sooner or later, every narrative gets tested. All the talk about Shedeur Sanders, the doubts, the comparisons, the shifting opinions, none of it really matters once the season starts. Because at that point, there's no filter, no interpretation, just results. And that's where the truth catches up. If Shedeur steps in and delivers, if he shows control, confidence, and the ability to move this offense forward, then everything changes. The conversation flips, the criticism fades, and suddenly the same people who questioned him are forced to look at him differently. Not as a question mark, but as an answer. But if things don't go that way, if the offense struggles, if the team doesn't improve, if the same issues show up week after week, then the doubts come right back, louder than before. And that's what makes this moment so real. Because there's no middle ground anymore. This isn't about potential. It's not about projections. It's about proof. For Shedeur, it's about proving he belongs at this level and can lead a team under pressure. For the Browns, it's about proving they made the right decision by putting their belief behind him. And for the people who have been shaping the narrative, it's about whether they were reading the situation correctly all along or reacting to something that was never fully there. Because once the games begin, everything gets exposed. Not just talent, but judgment. Not just performance, but perception. And that's why this story is bigger than it looks. Because it's not just about a quarterback trying to prove himself. It's about a situation where everyone involved is about to be tested at the exact same time. And the craziest part, we're about to find out who was right and who was.